Hi, physiology students. This is Wednesday's lecture. We're continuing with chapter 2, part 1 on cell metabolism. Now, on Monday, I finished talking about how our bodies metabolize glucose and glycogen, and that was a big lecture. Today's will be much more simple by comparison. We'll get into metabolism of lactic acid and perhaps lipids, and we won't get through all of it. This will be a little easier than Monday's lecture. So let me share my screen and let's start looking at our PowerPoint. Okay, so here we are. Okay, we had left off last time with all this. That was a lot, admittedly, but that was the hard part of the chapter. And now what we're going to talk about is we finished looking at metabolism of carbohydrates, glucose, and glycogen. Now we still have metabolism of lactic acid, lipids, and amino acids to go. Now I'm going to start this with another G word, like you needed another one. You have glucagon, you have glycogen, you have glycogenolysis, glycogenesis, all those enzymes that start with G. And now I'm going to give you another G word, gluconeogenesis. Gluco means glucose. The word neo means novel, and genesis means create. And what this word means is the creation, the genesis of glucose from a novel source. Really what it means is the creation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. Oops. Okay, now that can include making glucose from lactic acid, from lipids, from amino acids. Okay, our body can make glucose from all of these things and more. Okay, because glucose can be used to make these things. And remember, let me back up here. Okay, remember that when glucose goes through glycolysis, it makes pyruvate. And then pyruvate can be used through anaerobic respiration, make a little bit of ATP and lactic acid. So we looked at that process going this way, right? But if you take lactic acid, guess what? You can go back and make lactic acid into pyruvate. Pyruvate can go backwards through glycolysis to make glucose. The equations are going in both directions, okay? Okay, so what conditions have to occur for the body to metabolize lactic acid, to make lipids, lipogenesis, to break down lipids, lipolysis, or to metabolize amino acids? Well, lots of different things. Some could be normal and some could be problematic or pathological. So lactic acid metabolism occurs when you use skeletal muscle excessively. Okay, you will build up lactic acid. So what happens is that lactic acid is built up and there'll be a system that removes it, and we'll talk about that shortly. So lactic acid metabolism happens all the time, routinely. Okay, now in some cases, in heart and brain, not heat, heart and brain, let's get the typing better. Okay, we talked about that in a ischemic event. Okay, but skeletal muscle is not such a big deal. Lipogenesis. Lipogenesis occurs when you have excess glucose to use. Adipose and liver cells convert glucose into lipids. Okay, now lipids is a storage form of energy. So if you are lacking energy, if you run out of carbohydrates, lipolysis occurs when the body lacks carbohydrates and causes cells to break down lipids for energy. Okay? Now, amino acid metabolism occurs when you consume protein or with heavy skeletal muscle use, or during starvation. All starvation is extreme. Okay? When you're not eating enough and you've burned through your glucose and glycogen, you've burned through your fat stores, your body will turn to muscle next. So this just gives you an idea, okay, of what's happening. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about lactic acid. Now, on the first chapter, we talked about pH. We talked about how important it is for the body to maintain pH within a relatively narrow range. All right, so make this a little bigger here so you can see me. Okay, so when you use your skeletal muscles routinely, when you push them, you're going to be pumping out lactic acid into the bloodstream. It ends in the word acid. You know what it's going to do to your blood pH. It's going to drop it. Having a lot of lactic acid in your bloodstream causes metabolic acidosis, and that is a bad thing. If that lactic acid were not removed from the bloodstream, you would have major problems, okay? Acidosis is a bad thing. So, lactic acid is routinely removed from the bloodstream by the Cori cycle, and the liver does it. Okay, so let's make this a little bit bigger for you. So lactic acid is removed from the bloodstream by the Cori cycle, okay? The liver recycles lactic acid in the Cori cycle, and it can turn that lactic acid into glucose. Remember? Glucose can go through glycolysis to make pyruvate. Pyruvate, in the absence of oxygen, will ferment and produce lactic acid. That's what's happening in your skeletal muscles when you push them. There's no reason why that lactic acid can't be turned back into pyruvate, go backwards through glycolysis, and become glucose. It does. And the liver does this all the time, every day, all the time. So let's look at this diagram here. So here we have skeletal muscles that are being used heavily. They will burn through their glycogen stores and break down glucose 6-phosphate. It will use that glucose 6-phosphate, and eventually, if it is, and then it will convert it to pyruvic acid through glycolysis. Now, if a skeletal muscle runs out of oxygen, it will produce a little bit of ATP and lactic acid. That lactic acid spills into the bloodstream, and that can make your blood pH drop, and that's a bad thing. But the liver is here. Da, 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 da. It's the hero. It's going to prevent metabolic acidosis by taking lactic acid, making it go back into pyruvate. Pyruvate will go backward through glycolysis to make glucose 6-phosphate. Now, if the liver wanted to, it could take this glucose 6-phosphate, extra glucose, and it could convert it into glycogen and hold on to it if it wanted to. So glycogen synthase, the enzyme that synthesizes glycogen, turns this into glycogen. All right, and the liver will hold on to that until there's the signal of glucagon. All right, and then if there was glucagon, the liver could break the glycogen down with glycogen phosphorylase into the intermediate glucose 6-phosphate. And then because the liver has glucose 6-phosphatase, it breaks this down into free glucose that can spill into the bloodstream, okay? So we go back to stuff we learned on Monday, and is this important in human health? Yes, because excess skeletal muscle use can produce lactic acid that can drop your blood pH. What happens if someone's in liver failure? The liver can't do this, right? The liver can't recycle lactic acid, and without the liver doing this job, someone's blood pH will drop dramatically, and that will be a problem. So you might see metabolic acidosis in someone with liver failure, okay? Okay, so let's move on from lactic acid to lipid metabolism. Okay, lipid metabolism includes making lipids, lipogenesis, or breaking them down. So lipogenesis has the word genesis in it, and then lipo in front of it means lipid, making of lipids. Now this is the production of lipids from excess glucose, okay? So you can pretty much be sure that this glucose will be turned into pyruvate, and then the pyruvate will then go on through several metabolic steps into the creation of these lipids. Now the stimulus for making lipids is insulin. When your cells have the signal of insulin, they'll take up glucose and they'll use what glucose they need to produce ATP. And above and beyond what they need, tissues like your skeletal muscles, like your liver and fat cells, will take that glucose and convert it into fat and hold on to it. Well, especially your adipose tissue in your liver. Now, should you need energy, your cells are capable of lipolysis or lipolysis, the breakdown of lipids or white fat into molecules that can be used to make energy. Okay, the stimulus for the breakdown of fat is a stress hormone called cortisol. Epinephrine can also do this, okay? All right, so let's look at the first step, lipogenesis. So lipogenesis, making lipids, all right? If the insulin is in the bloodstream, your adipose and liver will take extra glucose above and beyond what it needs, and it will convert it into white fat, which is your storage form of fat, known as triglycerides. So here's what happens. The extra blood glucose enters glycolysis, that's why you need to learn this, and produces pyruvate. Pyruvate goes through pyruvate conversion to make acetyl-CoA. Now, from this point, acetyl-CoA could enter the Krebs cycle and make energy and go on through the rest of the pathway. But acetyl-CoA is used by the liver to make the following. Okay, cholesterol. That's a very important molecule. Ketones, we'll talk about that, and fatty acids. So let's back out and I'll define this. Cholesterol is used to make cell membranes. It's used to make steroid hormones and make what else am I? Oh, bile. Bile. What is bile used for? It's part of your digestive system. Bile is produced by the liver and it's stored in your gallbladder. And when you eat fatty food, your gallbladder will contract and spill that bile into the duodenum of the small intestine, and it'll start the breakdown of that fat. Okay, so cholesterol is pretty important. Ketones can be ATP, energy. And when no carbohydrates available. We'll talk about ketones, ketosis, and all that stuff. Now, fatty acids get converted into triglycerides or white fat. That is what we store in our fat stores under our skin. That's for long-term energy storage, okay? So basically cholesterol, ketones, and fatty acids are all lipids, okay? They're very different from each other, but they do act as lipids. Okay, now I've shown you this pathway. Glucose goes to pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is used to make these things in blue. Now, that's the pathway going in one direction, right? It can go backwards. So let's say you'd skipped a bunch of meals, you have no carbohydrates left. Now what your body's going to turn to next is your fat stores. And so what happens is your body will break down fatty acids. They can break down fatty acids into ketones, and you can use those for energy. You can break fatty acids into acetyl-CoA, all right? And acetyl-CoA can enter the Krebs cycle to make energy. Acetyl-CoA can go backwards through conversion to become pyruvate, and pyruvate can go backwards through glycolysis to make glucose. Guess what? Glucose can be turned into fat, and fat can be turned into glucose, all right? It's just the pathways are going in opposite directions. See, we just made fat from glucose. There's no reason why we can't take fat and make glucose out of it, because that's where it came from. Okay, so the long G word that is making glucose from a non-carbohydrate source, in this case, it's lipids. Gluconeogenesis, making glucose from a novel source like fat, because glucose creates fat. You can take fat and turn it back into glucose. All right, the body does not waste a thing. Okay, so that's making fat from extra glucose, and it can go backwards. So breaking down fat is just the reverse of the previous slide. You're just going up, okay? So you can take triglycerides, and they can be turned into ketones. All right, now that, I will talk about the human health of that. That is a process called Making ketones is called ketogenesis. Okay? Now, when you use ketones for energy as your primary source of energy because you lack carbohydrates, that's called ketosis. Okay. All right. Oh, back up. Okay, so you've probably heard of ketosis before, haven't you? You've talked, a lot of people, it's a fad going through ketosis. If you want to burn fat, go through ketosis. You deprive your body of carbohydrates and you eat, vegetables, fats, meats, things like that. And what happens is you're forcing your body to use fats for energy instead of carbohydrates, and you're going to burn body fat. However, this comes at a cost. Going through ketosis should never be more than a short-term strategy to lose weight. People should not be going through ketosis 24/7, 365 days a year, okay? It's going to cause kidney damage. It's going to stress your body out. Our bodies are designed, evolved to use carbohydrates most efficiently for energy. They can use fats, but that's usually an emergency strategy by the body, and you're going to stress the body out. So you have patients come in that are voluntarily going through ketosis. You need to talk to them about the dangers that can cause to the body. It's not a good thing. Going through ketosis will mobilize all these fatty acids in your bloodstream. It gets danger to the heart. It makes your cholesterol skyrocket. It's really not a good strategy. The other time you can see people go through ketosis is involuntarily when they're so sick um, that they can't eat or won't eat. So they will quickly lose all their carbohydrates. And if they're not eating, what their body's going to do is turn to the fat stores, and they'll go through ketosis because they're so sick they're not eating. And so sometimes you see patients in a hospital, they're very sick, going through ketosis. Now, the bad side about ketosis that I've already talked about, among other things, is it's an acidic molecule. And you've got ketones floating in your bloodstream, they're acidic. So it drops your blood pH. It's called metabolic acidosis. In fact, it's got its own specific word, ketoacidosis. So when you're going through ketosis, you're dropping your blood pH. I've already mentioned before, that's bad, okay? All right, so the triglycerides can also go back up and become fatty acids that are released into the bloodstream, and they can be converted back to acetyl-CoA. They can go through the Krebs cycle. The acetyl-CoA can be turned into pyruvate. The pyruvate can be turned into glucose. The pathway just keeps going up and up. So if we go completely backwards, triglycerides can be turned into fatty acids. Fatty acids can be turned into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA go backwards through conversion to be made into pyruvate. Pyruvate goes backward through glycolysis to make glucose, because fat came from glucose. So making glucose from fat is called gluconeogenesis. If it is skeletal muscle or the liver, it can take that glucose and create glycogen through the process called glycogenesis. What would be the enzyme necessary to turn glucose into glycogen? It ends in ASE, enzyme. It has the word synthesis in it, and it's synthesizing glycogen. So that would be glycogen synthase. All right? Okay, so let's go on the next slide. So ketogenesis, ketosis, ketoacidosis, metabolic acidosis, all of these things are relevant. So let's just go through these vocab words. Ketogenesis is making ketones, okay? You can make them from triglycerides. When you use energy, you're lacking carbs. I'll just say carb short for carbohydrates. That's ketosis. You're in ketosis. In fact, some people who are trying to go through ketosis, they get so happy because you can get ketone test strips from CVS or whatever, Walgreens, and you can test your urine if you're producing ketones, and they say, oh my God, I'm in ketosis. I'm so happy. I'm like, oh, we are so happy you're going through ketosis. All right, not a good thing. Ketoacidosis is the drop in blood pH from ketosis. That's bad. All right, that's not a good thing. Okay, and metabolic acidosis is metabolizing molecules that drop your blood pH. Okay, metabolic acidosis, we'll cover it later, can be caused by using ketones for energy, using fatty acids for energy, Lactic acid in your blood can drop your blood pH. That's metabolic acidosis. All those things can cause acidosis. But let's back up here and look at the clinical app on ketosis. All right, because that's going to be important in nursing, in everyday life for a nurse. Let me give it a minute to pull up here. All right, slow, but it's happening. Come on, clinical app, there you go. Okay, ketones can be used for energy by many organs, but it's an emergency strategy, all right? Can be found in the blood under normal conditions. Fasting, or you've got poorly regulated diabetes. Think about that. If you've got diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2, type 1, you're not producing enough insulin, so your cells aren't taking in glucose and using it. What are they going to turn to next for energy? Fats, like ketones. If they have type 2 diabetes, they have plenty of insulin, but their cells ignore it. So what are they going to turn to next for energy? Ketones. Okay, so secretion of abnormally high amounts of ketone bodies in the blood produces ketosis, one of the signs of fasting or uncontrolled diabetes. Okay, so I've talked about here if someone's going through ketosis willingly. Then there's the patient who's going through ketosis unwillingly. Uncontrolled diabetes, they are so sick they're not eating or they're starving. Okay, so those are the conditions you can see ketosis. All right. So just like I have a flow diagram for all the other things, I have a blank flow diagram. It looks just like this and the key on the online syllabus. And this is the making of lipids from glucose. So I want you to be able to practice that pathway. All right, glucose, extra glucose, goes through glycolysis to produce pyruvate. Pyruvate goes through conversion to make acetyl-CoA. The liver converts acetyl-CoA into cholesterol, ketones, fatty acids. Fatty acids can be made into white fat or triglycerides. Now, if you need to go backwards and turn fat into glucose, you can do it. Guess what? You just go backwards. Triglycerides go to fatty acids. Fatty acids can become ketones for energy, or fatty acids can become acetyl-CoA, which go back into pyruvate, which go back into glucose, and that would be gluconeogenesis. The pathway goes both directions. So if you learn it in one way, you know how it works in reverse, and using these flow diagrams will help you do that. So we're going to finish up amino acid metabolism on Friday. That will be a short little lecture, but that is all for today. So let's stop the share, and this would be good. So today we talked about lactic acid metabolism and lipid metabolism. All right, so I'll talk to you again on Friday.